All right, so now we're going to work with the half angle identities. This one is a little bit trickier to do, mostly because there's more steps to it. So once again, we have our half angle identities on our sheet here, and this time we have all three of them, because notice tangent has a couple different ones. There are some special things here. Notice almost every single one has a plus or minus in front. So we have to determine if it's positive or negative. And that's where it gets into issues. And I also see that I have a typo on this. These should all be divided by 2, not over y. So that's what makes them a half angle, is you're dividing them by 2. So it's the angles are cut in half. So to find these, oh, and we can also see that we can get away with just knowing cosine. So cosine would be our most convenient trig function that we need to find. But we are given tangent to start with. And so using some other identities to find cosine, I would probably go with this one. So we have tan squared plus 1 equals secant squared. Well, secant is the reciprocal of cosine. So if I can find secant, I can find the reciprocal of cosine. All right, so let's find cosine of x first. So here's our x. Our angle itself is in between 90 and 180. And this is going to be important to see because we actually use this twice here. So 90 degrees would be up here, and 180 degrees is over here. So our angle is somewhere in here. So this represents our angle of x. So cosine over here, if you remember, all students take calculus. Sine is the only thing positive. That means our cosine value, once we find this, will be negative. So let's set up our identity here. So we have tan squared of x plus 1 equals secant squared of x. Well, tan is negative square root of 8. So I've got negative square root of 8 squared plus 1 equals secant squared of x. This negative goes away with the square root goes away with the square, so I'm really left with 8 plus 1 equals secant squared of x. 8 plus 1 is 9. And then to get rid of the square, we would square root. And the square root of 9 is a very nice number, which is very convenient. But remember what we talked about, because we're here, cosine is negative. So we have a negative 3. So cosine and its reciprocal would be negative. But if secant of x is negative 3, we know that cosine of x will be its reciprocal, which is negative 1/3. So that's kind of an important thing to find. So we found our cosine of x. All right, so now that's kind of our important part that we need to find. And now we're going to actually find our half angle identities. So let's just start with sine of x over 2. So our half angle for sine. So sine of x over 2, that identity, is plus or minus 1 minus cosine x all over 2 and the square root of that. What we need to determine is if it's positive or negative. And I'm going to go ahead and write our cosine one down here just because we have to determine for both of them. Once we determine for one, we can figure out the other one pretty quick and easy. So this one's just different by having that plus in the middle. All right. With the half angle, so we're looking at x over 2. Well, this is our domain for x. So if we're wanting to find x over 2, if I divide each of these by 2, I can figure out where x over 2 is. So I'm going to put that over here. So x over 2 would be in between 90 degrees and 45 degrees. That means up here, here's our 90 degrees, here's 0 degrees, 45 would be right here in the middle. So 45 degrees. So this x over 2 angle is somewhere in here. So this right here represents our angle x over 2. So looking here, everything is positive. That means for both of these, our half angles, these will both be the positive versions of them. And now all we have to do is plug in our numbers, which we have cosine to be negative 1/3. So we have 1 minus a negative 1/3 divided by 2. Two negatives here do make this a plus. So 1 plus 1/3 ends up being 4/3 divided by 2. And 4/3 divided by 2 is 2/3. So our half angle for sine is 2/3. And we would just go ahead and leave that in the root and the fraction. It looks kind of ugly, but that is the way we're going to leave it. So same idea with cosine. So with cosine, once again, we've established that these are positive, which is why there's no negative symbol here. So we have 1 plus a negative 1/3, all divided by 2. Because it's a plus and negative, it's like a minus. So 1 minus 1/3 ends up being 2/3, all divided by 2. And 2/3 divided by 2 is 1/3. So that means that cosine of x over 2 is the square root of 1/3. So, and that is how you find the half angle of sine and the half angle of cosine. So there are some extra steps. You have to find the missing thing with the angle of x, determine where it's at, find our half angles and determine where that is at. And then we go through and using those signs. And the only thing we use this for is to determine, is it positive or is it negative? And they both were positive here. And then we find these missing things. Now this specific problem did not ask us to find tan of x over 2, but I'm going to go ahead and do that just so you can see how easy it is. We can use our traditional thing of it being sine over cosine again. It may look complicated, but it really isn't that bad. So sine was the square root of 2/3, and cosine was the square root of 1/3. We know back from algebra that if I have a square root divided by a square root, I can actually divide the things inside of it. So I'd have 2/3 divided by 1/3, all under a square root. Well, if I have 2/3 and divide it into thirds, that actually just equals 2. Or you can flip and multiply, whichever makes sense to you. But that means that tan with our half angle will just be the square root of 2. And it is positive because of where we're at. Remember that all students take calculus. But keep in mind, if sine and cosine are both positive, tangent's going to be positive as well. So hopefully this helps with the half angle. We found all of our angles. It was only a little bit complicated, but there you have it.